The Duke called their marriage a burden, so she disappeared until he found her childhood locket. There is a particular kind of hurt that does not announce itself loudly. It does not slam doors or break dishes. It just settles, slowly, like dust on a windowsill, so quietly that by the time you notice it, you have already been breathing it in for years. This story is about that kind of hurt, and about a woman who, one ordinary morning, decided she had breathed in enough. But before we get to the morning she left, we have to go back to the beginning, because nothing in this story makes sense without the beginning. The year was 1897. England was the kind of place where your whole life could be decided in a single conversation between two men over brandy, and you would never even be in the room when it happened. Lady Cecilia Hargrove was 24 years old. She was the daughter of a baron whose family name still carried weight, but whose bank accounts had been quietly emptying for years. Her father was not a bad man. He was simply a man who had made too many optimistic decisions and not enough careful ones, and now his daughter's future was the last good card he had left to play. The Duke of Ashbourne, Edward Percival Wyndham, the fifth of that name, was 31. He came from a family that had held the same land in Derbyshire for 200 years. He was tall, composed, and serious in the way that men who have inherited large responsibilities often are. Not unkind exactly, but sealed, like a letter that had never been opened. The arrangement was simple. Cecilia's family needed the financial backing that a connection to the Wyndham name could provide. Edward needed a duchess, specifically one who was presentable, educated, and unlikely to embarrass him. Cecilia was considered ideal. She spoke French, she played piano, she never said anything that caused a scene. She was, in the language of that world, suitable. Nobody asked her what she wanted. She would have said yes anyway. She understood the situation. She was not naive. She had watched her father age 10 years in the space of 2, had seen the worry behind his eyes every time he looked at her, and she loved him enough to do what she could. And besides, she had told herself this more than once. Maybe it would be all right. Maybe they would find their way to something real. People did, sometimes, even in arrangements. The wedding took place on a gray November morning. The church was full of people she barely knew and a few she did. The flowers were white hothouse roses that smelled slightly wrong, the way flowers do when they have been forced to bloom before their time. She wore her mother's pearl earrings. The Duke stood at the altar looking like a man completing an administrative task he had been assigned to, and when the priest told him to take her hand, there was a half-second pause before he did. Nobody noticed that pause except Cecilia. She noticed everything. They moved into Ashbourne Hall, the main house in Derbyshire, and life arranged itself into a pattern that was, by all visible measures, perfectly fine. Edward was not cruel. She wants you to understand that. He never raised his voice at her. He never humiliated her in front of others. He ensured she had everything the household could provide: a full staff, horses, her own carriage, accounts at London's best dressmakers. If she mentioned that the morning room was cold, it was fixed within the day. If she expressed interest in a particular book, it appeared on her desk. What he did not give her was his attention, not real attention anyway, not the kind where someone actually looks at you. He spoke to her at breakfast about the weather and about estate business. He informed her which dinners they were required to attend and which she could decline. He was present at the table in the evenings and answered her questions with complete sentences, and occasionally even a follow-up observation. But there was always something slightly off about it, the way there is something off about a painting where the proportions are almost right, but not quite. She could feel it, without being able to name it. He never once asked her what she was thinking. Not once in the entire first year of their marriage did he ask her what was going on in her mind. He did not ask what she was reading, or whether she agreed with his opinion on the political situation, or whether she was happy. The possibility that her inner life might be worth inquiring about seemed simply not to occur to him. Cecilia bore this with the composure she had been raised to produce on demand. She was an excellent duchess. She learned the household, the staff, the tenants, the rhythms of the estate. She appeared at every required event, dressed perfectly, smiled appropriately, and said all the right things to all the right people. The people of Derbyshire thought the Duke had done well for himself. The people of London agreed. At night, in the room she slept in alone, this was not unusual for houses of that kind. Separate rooms were the norm. She sometimes lay awake and tried to locate exactly what it was she was feeling. It was not heartbreak. She had not loved him before they married, so there was no love to lose. It was something quieter and in some ways more persistent than heartbreak. It was the feeling of being beside someone and being invisible, of existing in a space and leaving no impression on it. She had a habit, in her loneliest moments, of reaching for a small silver locket she kept on her bedside table. It had been her mother's, and her mother had given it to her the winter before she died, pressing it into Cecilia's 12-year-old hands and saying, "When the world is unkind, remember that someone loved you first." Inside were 2 tiny photographs, her mother at 20, bright-eyed and slightly blurry the way all old photographs are, and Cecilia herself at 8, gap-toothed and squinting at the sun. She would open it, look at the 2 photographs, close it again, and go to sleep. It was a small thing, but it was hers. The second year was much like the first, and then one Wednesday morning in February of 1899, everything changed. Not dramatically, not with any kind of confrontation or scene, just a door, and what came through it. Cecilia had come downstairs earlier than usual. She had been lying awake since 5, and had eventually given up on sleep and decided she would catch Edward before his morning appointments and ask him about the household accounts for the spring season. She came down the main staircase in her dressing gown, her hair still loose, and she could hear voices from the library. The door was ajar, maybe 2 inches, just enough. Edward was speaking to his solicitor, Mr. Fenn, a thin, careful man who came to the house twice a year. Edward's voice was even and slightly impatient, the way it got when he was discussing something he considered inefficient. She heard him say, "This arrangement has become a burden I did not ask for. I have obligations enough without managing a wife who requires managing." Mr. Fenn said something in a low voice that she could not make out. She stood in the corridor for what felt like a very long time. Later she would try to remember exactly how it felt, and the best she could come up with was this. It felt like stepping on a stair that was not there. That half-second of nothing before the floor comes up to meet you. Except the floor never came. She just kept falling through the nothing. She did not push the door open. She did not walk in and say, "What, exactly? What do you say to a man who does not know you heard him? What do you say to someone who has just described you, casually, to his solicitor, the way a man describes a broken fence that needs to be dealt with?" She turned around. She walked back up the stairs. She sat down at her writing desk, and she opened the locket. She looked at her mother's face for a long time. She looked at the little girl squinting at the sun. Then she closed the locket, set it down on the desk in front of her, and she made a decision. Not impulsively. She was not an impulsive woman, but clearly. The way you make a decision when you realize you have actually already made it. You are just now catching up to yourself. She was going to leave. Here is something people often get wrong about quiet women. They assume that because a woman does not make a scene, she is not paying attention. That because she does not argue, she does not have thoughts. That because she absorbs things without reaction, she has no interior. That she is simply a surface, placid and empty. Cecilia Wyndham was not a surface. She was a very deep lake that had learned, over many years, to look still. She did not leave the next day, or the next week, or even the next month. She had no intention of doing anything rash. She had watched impulsive decisions ruin people, and she was not going to let that happen to her. If she was going to go, she was going to go properly, with thought and preparation, and she was going to land somewhere safe. Over the following 6 months she did the following things, quietly and without anyone noticing. She wrote a letter to her old governess, Miss Alderton, who was 73 years old, completely trustworthy, and living in Bath. She explained only that she needed a small favor. Miss Alderton, who had known Cecilia since she was 7, asked no questions, and agreed immediately. She found a cottage. It was in a small village on the coast of Cornwall, Porthcressa, a cluster of whitewashed houses on a cliff above the sea. Population perhaps 200, not on the way to anywhere in particular. She leased it under Miss Alderton's name. She had visited the village once as a girl and had never forgotten it. The sound of the water, the particular gray-green color of the sea in October, the way the wind came in off the Atlantic and smelled like something that had never been near a city. She set aside money from her own pin money, month by month, in an amount small enough that it would not raise questions in the household accounts. It took 5 months to save what she calculated she would need. She made a list of what she would take. It was a short list. 2 trunks. Her books. Not all of them, just the ones she had actually read and loved. Her warmest clothes. Her writing materials. Some practical things. Medicines. Candles. A good knife for the kitchen. She did not put the locket on the list. She was not sure, at that point, whether she would take it. In October 1899, almost 8 months after the morning of the library door, she told Edward that she was going to visit an old school friend in Bath. She gave him the name of someone real who lived there, someone who had, in fact, written to her once or twice over the years. She said she would be gone for a few weeks. Edward said, "Of course. I hope you enjoy yourself. The way you say it when you are already thinking about something else." She stood in the entrance hall while her trunks were loaded. She had dressed carefully. She always dressed carefully, and she looked exactly as she always looked, composed, presentable, the very picture of a duchess on her way to a social visit. Edward came out of his study to say goodbye. He kissed her on the cheek. This surprised him slightly. She had not done that in some time, and for 1 second she thought she saw something shift behind his eyes, something uncertain. But then it was gone, and he nodded and went back to his study. She got into the carriage. She did not look back at the house as they drove away. She had decided she would not do that, and she kept to it. The cottage in Porthcresso was small and slightly damp, and entirely wonderful. It sat on the edge of the village with a low stone wall around a garden that had clearly been left to its own devices for at least a season, and a view of the sea from the kitchen window that made you forget, temporarily, whatever you had been worrying about. The ceiling in the main room was low, and the fireplace was bigger than the room strictly required, and everything smelled of salt and old wood. She introduced herself to the woman at the neighboring house as Mrs. Clare, a widow from London looking for quiet and sea air. The woman, whose name was Agnes and who was approximately 60 and had the direct, comfortable manner of someone who has nothing to prove to anyone, said, "You'll find plenty of both here," and brought her a pot of soup that evening without asking if it was wanted. That was how Cecilia met the first person who would know her as herself, rather than as an arrangement. The first weeks were strange. She was not used to silence. Not this kind of silence, which was not really silence at all, but the sound of the sea and the wind and the occasional gull, a silence that had texture and movement, rather than the flat, airless quiet of a large house, where people are very carefully not saying things. She was not used to making her own decisions about how to spend each hour. She was not used to eating whatever she wanted for breakfast without thinking about what the cook had planned or what the household schedule required. She made a great many mistakes in the first month. She burned things on the stove. She misjudged the tides and got her boots soaked on the beach. She planted seeds in the kitchen garden in the wrong order and then had to replant half of them. None of these things destroyed her. Each one taught her something she had not known about herself, that she was more competent than she had been given opportunity to discover, and that making mistakes when the only person watching was herself was a completely different experience from making mistakes when they could reflect on your husband's house. She walked every morning. This was the thing she valued most. Every morning, before breakfast, she would pull on her gray wool coat and her boots, and she would walk the cliff path, a long, uneven trail that curved around the headland and gave you, at the highest point, a view in every direction that made the rest of the world feel very manageable by comparison. She walked in the rain. She walked when it was cold enough that her breath made small clouds. She walked on the mornings when the sea was the color of slate, and on the mornings, rare but extraordinary, when it was almost blue. She brought the locket. She had not planned to. On the morning she left Ashbourne Hall, standing in her bedroom doing a final check of her bags, she had picked it up and held it and thought, "I am starting over. Maybe I should start completely. Maybe leaving this here would mean something." And then she had thought, but it was my mother's. And it was hers before it was anything else, so she had put it in her coat pocket, and it had gone with her, and she wore it every day in Cornwall. She read. She wrote long letters to Miss Alderton, who wrote back faithfully. She learned from Agnes how to preserve vegetables and how to read the weather by the behavior of the birds. She began, tentatively, to write something. Not a letter, not a diary exactly, more like an account of things she had observed and thought about, written for nobody in particular, just to have somewhere to put them. She did not miss Edward. She missed the idea of what they might have been. That was a different thing, and she had known the difference for some time. She did not contact anyone from her previous life. Not her father. She wrote him a single letter explaining that she was safe, and that he should not worry, and that she needed time, and she knew he would honor that, because he was a man who understood the cost of not having been listened to, and was not going to make the same mistake twice. Not her friends, such as they were, connections of circumstance more than genuine intimacy. Nobody. The weeks became months. October became December. December became the new year. Porthcressa had its own rhythm, fishing boats going out in the early morning, the market on Thursdays, the way the village pub sounded on a Friday evening from the outside, if you happened to be walking past. She became part of the rhythm in her own small way. She was simply Mrs. Clare, the quiet widow who grew things in her garden and walked the cliff path every morning and sometimes stopped to talk at length with Agnes about weather or plants or the price of fish. She realized one morning on the headland, standing with the wind pulling at her coat and the sea going in every direction below her, she was happy. Not the performed, curated contentment she had maintained at Ashbourne Hall, but something real, small and impermanent maybe, the way all real things are, but genuinely hers. At Ashbourne Hall, things were not going well, when Cecilia's school friend in Bath, confused by a letter from Edward's secretary, confirmed that she had received no visit. Edward understood that his wife had not gone where she said she was going. That was the Tuesday. By Friday he understood that she had not gone somewhere temporarily different from where she said. She had gone. The realization moved through him in stages, the way cold water does when you step into it. First just your feet, then your ankles, then the cold climbing up until there is no part of you it has not reached. He handled it the way he handled most things, practically and with minimal outward disruption. He engaged a private inquiry firm, discreet men who did this kind of work for families who needed things handled without gossip. He wrote to her father, who replied with a letter that was, Edward thought, perhaps more honest than it needed to be. The letter said, I am sorry, but I am not entirely surprised. I hope you will reflect on that. He set that letter down and did not respond to it for 3 days. He searched her rooms himself. He could have sent a maid to do it, but he went himself. He was not sure, afterwards, what he had been looking for. Some explanation, maybe. Some note. Something that would make it make sense in a way he could file away and move past. What he found told him very little and everything. Her rooms were immaculate. Not cleared, there were things still there. Books on the shelves, a few dresses in the wardrobe, her writing materials on the desk, but ordered, in the way that things are ordered when someone has thought carefully about what to take and what to leave. Every piece of jewelry he had given her, the pearls for their first Christmas, the sapphire brooch for her birthday, the diamond earrings from London, was arranged on the dressing table, neatly, as though she had laid each piece down with consideration. She had left behind everything he had given her. She had taken only what had been hers before she ever met him. He sat on the edge of her bed for a while. He could not have said how long. He was not, he told himself, particularly emotional. He was practical. He was good in a crisis. He had managed the estate through a bad harvest and a legal dispute and a fire in the East Wing. He was good at problems. He would manage this one the same way, except that sitting on the edge of that bed, in that immaculate room, he found he could not quite locate the part of himself that knew how to be practical about this, because this was not a broken fence, or a drainage problem, or a legal complication. This was a person who had decided that wherever she was without him was better than wherever she was with him, and the evidence that she had been right to decide that, the carefully chosen absence, the returned jewelry, the rooms left like a letter he did not know how to read, the evidence was sitting all around him. He went back to his study, he did his work, he ate his dinners, he attended his commitments, and at night, in the quiet of the house, he felt something he had no name for. It was not guilt exactly, though there was some of that. It was not grief exactly, though there was some of that too. It was the feeling of a space where something had been, not a dramatic volcanic absence, just a place where the air was different, where the house was missing something he had not noticed was there until it was not. December came. The enquiry firm had found nothing yet. Edward had, in a moment he was not proud of, considered simply releasing a statement that his wife was in poor health and recovering at a private location, the sort of social lie that families of their kind made routinely. He had drafted it and then not sent it. It felt wrong in a way he could not entirely articulate, which was itself unusual. He was not a man who spent much time on things he could not articulate. The east wing of the house was being reorganized that month, something Cecilia had been planning before she left, the kind of seasonal household task that his housekeeper carried out with her usual efficiency. As part of this, old trunks and chests in the storage rooms were being inventoried and cleared. Edward was not a man who participated in household inventories, but he was also a man who could not sit still that December, which was new, and he had run out of ways to be busy. So on a Tuesday afternoon he found himself in one of the old storage rooms, working through a chest that had apparently belonged to his grandmother. At the bottom, beneath a winter cloak that smelled of cedar and age, his hand closed around something small and cold. He drew it out, a silver locket on a thin chain, oval-shaped, not much bigger than his thumbnail. The silver was worn smooth, the way things get when they have been handled regularly over a long time. He did not recognize it. He pried it open. Inside, 2 photographs, both faded at the edges, the way old photographs go. A young woman he did not know, dark hair, a serious expression that had something warm underneath it, and a small girl, maybe 7 or 8, with a gap in her front teeth, squinting into the sun as though she had been asked to look at it directly. He stared at the photographs for a long time. He had never seen the locket before. He had not known she had it. He did not know, sitting there in the cold storage room with the chest at his feet, that the young woman in the photograph was her mother, who had died when Cecilia was 14, or that the gap-toothed girl squinting into the sun was Cecilia herself. He would learn these things later. What he understood now, sitting there, was this. This was not something she had forgotten to pack. You do not forget something you have clearly worn close to you for years. The chain was the kind of worn-through soft that only comes from constant wearing. You do not forget something this small, this portable, something this easy to slip into a coat pocket. She had left it on purpose. She had taken everything that was hers, and she had left this one thing behind. This one small thing that was clearly the most personal object she owned. And the only reason she would leave the most personal thing she owned. He stopped thinking about it. He could not continue that line of thought in the direction it was going, because the direction it was going was too large and he was not ready for it in the storage room on a Tuesday afternoon in December. He closed his hand around the locket. He got up off the floor. He went back to his study. He sat at his desk for a very long time without touching anything on it. Then he took out the latest report from the inquiry firm, which he had been reading and setting aside for 2 months, and he read it again, properly this time. He read the address at the bottom of the 3rd page, the small village in Cornwall, the name of the lane, the description of the cottage with the low stone wall, and he did not set it aside. He did not go immediately. The decision to go was immediate, or rather, it had already been made by the time he stood up from his desk, but he did not go the next morning or the next week. He needed time, not to prepare practically. The practical preparation took an hour, but to figure out what he was going to say. This took considerably longer, because he had very little experience with saying the kind of things that were required here. He was good at reports, and decisions, and instructions. He was not good at the kind of conversation where you had to arrive at your own understanding of yourself, and then put it into words someone else could hear. He did not know how to do that. He was not sure he had ever done it. He tried writing it. He filled and discarded several pages. He tried practicing it aloud, which he had never done in his life, and which felt extremely strange. He thought about it while he was working, and while he was eating, and while he was doing the things he did at night to try to sleep, which were not working. In the end, he accepted that he could not prepare for it. He could not write the right words in advance, because he did not know yet what the right words were. He would have to go and find out when he got there. He came to Porth Cressa on a cold February morning, more than a year after she had disappeared. He came alone, in a hired carriage, without his valet, without any announcement. He was wearing an ordinary coat, and he had not brought a card, or a letter, or anything except the locket in his coat pocket. The village was small, and the cottage was not hard to find. He left the carriage at the inn at the top of the lane, and he walked down on foot. The lane was narrow, and the stone walls on either side were covered with the kind of winter moss that turns a particular vivid green in cold weather, and the sea was audible from where he walked, and the air smelled of salt, and something organic and wild that he had never smelled in Derbyshire. He was not expecting to find her immediately. He thought he would go to the cottage, knock, wait. Perhaps she would not be there. Perhaps she would refuse to open the door. Instead, coming around the bend in the lane, he saw her on the cliff path above, a gray wool coat, a basket over one arm, walking with the kind of easy, certain stride that belongs to someone who knows exactly where they are and is glad to be there. Something about the way she walked stopped him completely. She had not walked like that at Ashbourne. He was certain of it, though he could not have said at that moment in what way she had walked differently, only that this was different, that this was someone who had stopped bracing. She saw him at the same moment he saw her. She stopped. For a few seconds neither of them moved. The wind came in off the sea. Somewhere above them, a large bird turned slow circles. He reached into his coat pocket. He held out the locket. "You left this," he said. It was not what he had planned. He had planned something considerably more articulate. But standing at the bottom of the cliff path looking up at her, at the color in her face that had not been there before, at the expression she was wearing that was not performing anything, that was simply waiting to see what he would do, standing there, it was the only true thing he had. She looked at the locket in his hand. Then she looked at him. She had the same careful, direct look she had given him perhaps twice in their entire marriage, the look that was not bothering to be anything except honest. "I know," she said. "I left it on purpose." "I know," he said. "I understand that now." A pause. "Do you?" she said, not aggressively, not with the edge of someone who wants a fight, just checking, as someone checks the ground before they step on it. He said, "I'm beginning to." They did not have the big conversation that morning. Cecilia came down from the cliff path, and she looked at him for a moment on the lane, and then said, with the matter-of-fact practicality that had always been one of the things most genuinely characteristic of her, "Come and have some tea. You look cold." He followed her to the cottage. He ducked slightly going through the low front door. She put the kettle on. He sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the sea through the window and said nothing, because he did not know what to say and she did not seem to require him to say anything yet. Agnes from next door knocked and put her head in, took one look at Edward's face and the general atmosphere of the kitchen, said, "I'll come back later," with complete equanimity, and disappeared again. Edward felt absurdly grateful for this. Cecilia made tea and sat down across from him and they drank it, and outside the sea did what it did, and the fire in the grate did what it did, and eventually she said, "How did you find me?" "I hired people to find you," he said. "They found you 2 months ago." "You waited 2 months. I needed to know what I was going to say." "And do you?" "Not entirely," he said. "I came anyway." She considered this for a moment. Then she said, "That might be the most honest thing you have ever said to me." He thought about disputing that. He thought for a moment about saying something about how he had always been honest, how he had always been fair, how he had given her everything she needed, and then he looked at her face, and he understood that saying that would be exactly the kind of thing he had always done, which was confuse giving someone things with giving them attention, and he was not going to do that today. "I heard you," he said instead. "That morning, the library." Something changed very slightly in her expression. Not softened, tightened, actually. The way the face goes when something that has been held for a long time is acknowledged out loud. "I thought you might have," she said. "I didn't know. I should have." He stopped, tried again. "What I said to Fen. The way I spoke about a burden," she said quietly. Not bitterly, just clearly. "Yes," he said. "You called our marriage a burden you didn't ask for." "Yes." "In front of your solicitor." "Yes." He did not look away from her. He had decided, coming down the lane, that whatever happened in this room, he was going to stay present for it. He owed her at least that. "I am not going to tell you I didn't mean it. I don't know what I meant. I know it was a thoughtless way to speak about you, and I know that you heard it through a door, and I know that I should have been speaking differently about you long before that morning." The kitchen was very quiet. "Yes," she said, "you should have." He came back 3 more times over the following weeks. Each visit was longer than the last. The first had lasted a few hours. By the 4th, he stayed 2 days and slept in the small room at the back of the cottage that she used for storage, on a narrow bed that was too short for him, under a wool blanket that smelled of salt, and he slept better than he had in months. She told him things in those 4 visits that she had been carrying for the entire length of their marriage. She told them without drama, without scenes. She was not built for scenes, but with a precision and completeness that he found, after the first shock of it, steadying. It was like being given a clear account of a situation that had been confused. He had not realized how much of what had been between them he had misread, or not read at all. She told him about the corridor, not just the words she had heard, but what it had felt like to stand there, the image she had had of herself in that moment, as a piece of furniture that had been assessed and found inconvenient. The particular indignity of it. She told him about the 2 years before that morning, about what it had been like to live beside someone who was physically present and entirely elsewhere, about trying to find ways to be interesting enough, useful enough, sufficiently composed, sufficiently unremarkable, simultaneously, always working out which version of herself was required, and never being asked which version she actually was. She told him about the locket, about her mother, and what her mother had said, and what it meant to her. She told him that on the morning after the library door, she had sat with the locket for a long time and thought about the girl in the photograph, and about what her mother would have said to her, and that her mother, she was quite certain, would have told her to go. Not because running away was brave, but because staying in a place that was slowly convincing you that you were invisible was a different kind of cowardice. That women were very well trained to call that kind of staying loyalty. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not defend himself, or rather, when the instinct to defend himself came, which it did several times, he noticed it and let it pass without acting on it. This was very difficult. He had not been in the habit of letting instincts pass without acting on them. But he was beginning to understand that the whole problem, essentially, had been that he had never in his life genuinely sat still and listened to her, and that doing it now, badly, imperfectly, late, but doing it, was the only useful thing he had to offer. After the 3rd visit, walking back to the inn at the top of the lane, he stopped at the stone wall, where the path curved, and looked at the sea for a while. He thought about the years. He thought about the things she had described. He thought about a young woman arriving at a house that would never quite be hers, arranging everything perfectly, managing everything competently, being everything that was required, and the man in that house simply accepting it all as his due, as the correct and expected functioning of a life he had been given. He thought about Mr. Finn and the library door and the word burden. He was not a man who was easy on himself, when he finally allowed himself to be honest about something. That was one thing he had that was worth keeping. She was not going to be persuaded by the fact of his coming to Cornwall, or by the quality of his remorse, however genuine she believed it to be. She had spent 4 months in Porthcressa, becoming a person who breathed properly, and she had no intention of walking back into Ashbourne Hall and unbecoming her. She told him this plainly. She said, "I am not the same person who left. I am not going to be managed or invisible and then managed in alternation. If I come back, it will be to a different arrangement, one in which I am a person in that house, not a piece of its furnishings. And I will need to see evidence over time. that you understand the difference. Not your word on it. Evidence. He said, "Tell me what that looks like." So she told him. She was very specific. She told him she would need to be spoken to, rather than managed. To be asked her opinion, and have it treated as a real opinion, rather than a social pleasantry. To know that when something was wrong between them, they would speak about it to each other, and not around it. She told him she needed the locket to be something he understood the meaning of. Not just returned, but understood. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "I don't know if I can do all of that well. I can promise to try, and I can promise to tell you when I'm failing, rather than pretend I'm not. I don't know what else honest looks like here." This was, she thought, considerably more self-aware than she had expected from him. It was also, she thought, the truth. She had lived with this man for 3 years, and she knew the particular quality of his honest moments. This was one of them. "All right," she said. "We'll see." She came back to Ashbourne Hall in the spring of 1901, 18 months after she had left. She came back in her own time, in her own carriage, with her 2 trunks and her books and her writing materials and her mother's locket, which she wore around her neck. The staff were surprised. Edward had told them only that the Duchess would be returning, and that the house should be prepared. He had not explained further, and the staff, who were good at their jobs, which meant knowing when not to ask questions, had prepared the house and said nothing. She asked, when she arrived, that her sitting room be arranged differently. She had always disliked the way the furniture was placed. It made the light wrong in the afternoons. In the 3 years she had lived there before, she had never said this. She said it now. Edward said, "Of course, however you like." And then he said, "Why didn't you say before?" And she said, "Because I didn't think it would be listened to." And he was quiet for a moment and then said, "I understand." Which she thought was, given who he was, the best possible thing he could have said. It was not a perfect story after that. Life is not organized like that. People are not organized like that. Certainly not people who come to each other already shaped by years of habit and expectation, already formed into the grooves of who they have been. Edward was better than she had expected, and worse than she had hoped, and both of those things were true at the same time. There were weeks when he asked her questions and listened to the answers, and the house felt genuinely different, fuller, like a room that has been aired out. And there were other weeks when the old habits came back, when he retreated into his study and his accounts and his slightly sealed way of being, and she had to decide each time whether this was a moment that required a conversation or a moment that required patience. She had more patience now, not the suppressed, effortful patience of before, the patience that had really been a different name for silence and accommodation, but a genuine patience that came from knowing she had a choice. She was there because she had chosen to come back. That made everything different. She also had less tolerance. This was new, and it surprised him sometimes. If something needed to be said, she said it. If she disagreed, she said so. Not harshly, not with the sharpness of someone who has been waiting a long time to be sharp, but plainly. As a person who has an opinion and expects it to be heard, he was not always graceful about it, but he listened. More often than not, he listened. She kept writing, the account she had begun in Cornwall, which eventually became something longer and more deliberate, though she never showed it to anyone. She kept her friendship with Agnes, writing letters that went back and forth to Cornwall for years. She kept the habit of the morning walk, even in Derbyshire, where the landscape was different, but the usefulness of walking with your own thoughts was the same. She wore the locket every day. Edward never asked her directly about it. But she noticed, once or twice, that he looked at it when he thought she wasn't watching. She did not know what he thought when he looked at it. She thought that whatever it was probably more complicated and more honest than anything he would have thought before that February in Cornwall, and that was enough. Edward Wyndham died in 1919. He was 53. It was the influenza, the same wave that moved through England that year without announcing itself, taking people quickly and indiscriminately regardless of who they were. He was ill for 9 days. Cecilia was with him for all of them. On the last morning she sat beside his bed and held his hand, and the window was open because he had always preferred air, even when he was cold, and the early spring light came in and lay in strips across the floor, and she held his hand, and he was too weak to say much, but he looked at her locket. She was wearing it, as she always did, and he said, very quietly, "I should have asked about that sooner." She said, "You asked eventually." He closed his eyes. She kept holding his hand. She was 57 when he died. She lived until 1931. She spent those 12 years in the way she had spent the better part of the years before, managing the estate competently, walking every morning, writing things down, being present in the places she chose to be present in. She went back to Porthcressa once, a few years after his death, just to see it. The cottage had new tenants. Agnes had died, peacefully, at 81, in the same house she had always lived in. The cliff path was the same. The sea was the same particular gray-green it had always been. She stood on the headland for a long time, with the wind coming in off the Atlantic, and she thought about the woman she had been when she arrived there, and the woman she had become when she left. She thought about the locket in her pocket on the morning she came down the stairs in her dressing gown. She thought about a half-open library door. She thought about how close she had come to staying, how many women had stayed, how much courage it had taken, quiet, private, unwitnessed courage, to go. And then she walked back down the cliff path to the village, and she got into her carriage, and she went home. She was wearing the locket. End.